It is 2:47 in the morning. You know this without looking at your phone because your body already told you. There is no sound in the room. No alarm. No notification. Just the particular silence of being completely awake when you should be completely asleep, and a set of numbers already running at the back of your skull. You did not choose to start running these numbers. They started on their own. Rent is due on Friday. The number is clear. On the left side of that equation, the rent. On the right side of that equation, the bank balance. And the gap between those two sides, that gap is the reason you are awake right now at 2:47 in the morning, staring at the ceiling while the rest of your household sleeps. You have done this math before. You know the answer. But something in the brain refuses to stop running it, as though running it again at a slightly different angle might produce a different result. It will not. But the calculation continues anyway, looping, burning through the quiet hours of the night, as though each pass through the numbers might locate an exit that was not there the last time. This is not anxiety. Not exactly. It is something more specific than that. It is the sound of a very particular kind of financial pressure that anyone who has ever been genuinely close to the edge will recognize immediately. Not the vague worry of someone wondering whether they saved enough for retirement. The specific, physical, involuntary arithmetic of not having enough margin between what is owed and what is available to feel safe going back to sleep. Before we go any further, one thing needs to be stated plainly. What follows is a discussion of documented behavioral economics research and general financial principles drawn from peer-reviewed academic literature and publicly available data. It is not individualized financial advice. The specific psychological effects described in this video apply to financial scarcity broadly. The $10,000 figure is an illustrative milestone rooted in real research, not a clinical threshold, and the dynamics we are discussing begin to apply at amounts both below and above it, depending on your income, household size, and the cost of your nearest financial emergency. With that stated, let's continue. Because what the research actually shows is more striking than any version of financial advice I could give you. If you have never experienced that specific calculation at 2:47 in the morning, this video will give you an understanding of what it feels like from the inside. And if you have experienced it, or if you are experiencing it right now, then what I am about to tell you may be the most important reframe you will encounter about your own financial life. Because here is what is actually happening when that calculation runs at 2:47. And here is why it does not stop. And here is the precise, peer-reviewed, replicated scientific reason that the first $10,000 you save changes something that has nothing to do with $10,000. The first thing you need to understand is that you have been living inside a cage. Not a metaphor cage. A real, structural, neurological cage, built out of the specific cognitive consequences of financial scarcity. And the reason it is so difficult to see from the inside is that the cage is not made of what you cannot afford. It is made of the mental bandwidth that financial pressure is consuming every single moment you are operating close to the edge. Think about how you make decisions when money is tight. Not just the financial decisions. All of them. Zoom into this specific window. Compare these two models side by side. On the left, a decision made with margin. On the right, the same decision made without it. Every single decision, when you are operating below a certain financial threshold, runs first through a single filter before anything else can happen. The filter sounds like this: can I afford to be wrong? Before you take the job with slightly better long-term prospects but a 3-week gap in pay, the filter runs. Before you decide whether to go to the doctor about something that might be nothing, or might not be, the filter runs. Before you negotiate your rent, your salary, your terms on anything at all, the filter runs. Even before you respond to a message from someone you care about after a bad financial week, the filter runs. Notice this pattern. Look closely at this bounded section right here. The filter is not caution. Caution is a choice. The filter is structural. It runs whether you want it to or not, and it narrows every available path down to one question before you are allowed to evaluate anything else. Can I afford to be wrong about this? That filter is not a character flaw. It is not evidence of poor decision-making. It is not something that discipline or intention or positivity can override. It is a product of what happens to human cognitive capacity under conditions of financial scarcity, and it has been studied, documented, replicated, and published in peer-reviewed scientific literature with a degree of precision that should permanently change how you think about every financial decision you have ever made when you were close to the edge. In 2013, two researchers, Sendhil Mullainathan of Harvard and Eldar Shafir of Princeton, published a landmark study in the journal Science. The book that followed is called Scarcity: Why Having Too Little Means So Much. And the finding at the center of their work is this: financial scarcity does not just change what you can afford. It changes how your brain works. Read these exact words carefully. This is not a metaphor. Not a self-help reframe. A measurable, replicated, peer-reviewed change in actual cognitive function, caused by operating under financial pressure. Here is the study. Mullainathan and Shafir went to a shopping mall in New Jersey. They recruited participants across a range of income levels and primed half of them to think about a specific financial problem. Your car has broken down, and the repair will cost $1,200. Think about how you would handle that. Then they administered a cognitive battery, a set of tests measuring working memory, fluid intelligence, self-control capacity, and problem-solving ability. The results are the single most striking piece of data I will give you today. Low-income participants who were primed to think about the car repair showed significant impairment in cognitive performance compared to low-income participants in the control group. Now track this number carefully, because this is where the bold headline needs to stop you in your tracks. The magnitude of that impairment was equivalent to a 13-point drop in IQ, or the cognitive effect of losing a full night of sleep. Now pause and look at this contrast side by side. On the left, high-income participants primed with the same scenario showed no meaningful impairment. The $1,200 car repair was a problem, but it did not consume enough of their mental resources to measurably affect cognitive function. On the right, the low-income participants experienced something genuinely different at the neurological level. Not a different attitude. Not a different work ethic. A different, measurably lower capacity to think clearly, plan ahead, and execute well, produced by the cognitive cost of that single financial scenario. Now here is what makes this finding critical to understand about your own life. The $1,200 car repair was not real. It was hypothetical. They were asked to think about it for a few minutes before taking the tests. They did not lose the money. The impairment happened anyway. Which means that the 2:47 in the morning math, the filter running before every decision, the bandwidth being consumed while you try to evaluate your options in every area of life, that consumption is happening continuously. Not just when a bill arrives. Not just when an emergency hits. The background cognitive cost of operating close to the edge is always running, always consuming mental resources that would otherwise be available for planning, creativity, self-regulation, and the kind of clear-headed long-term thinking that would help you get further from the edge. Mullainathan and Shafir called this the bandwidth tax. Follow this concept as it builds from the bottom of the frame upward. Cognitive bandwidth is the total mental resource you have available for thinking, planning, problem-solving, and self-control. It is not unlimited. And when financial pressure is present, it captures a portion of that bandwidth continuously, leaving less available for everything else. The tax is not occasional. It runs in the background the way a program runs in the background on a computer, consuming processing power even when you are not actively thinking about money, slowing down every other operation that depends on the same resource. They also gave this narrowing of attention a specific name. They called it tunneling. Inside this bounded concept right here, tunneling is what happens when scarcity captures your attention so completely that the immediate problem fills your entire field of awareness. Everything outside the tunnel, the long-term plan, the relationship you meant to invest in, the health appointment you meant to schedule, the opportunity that would have been obvious if you had been operating with more margin, disappears. Not because you forgot. Not because you do not care. Because the tunnel is real, and it is driven by biology, not by character. Now let's look at where tunneling appears in the most consequential corners of your life, because this is not limited to the arithmetic you run at 2:47 in the morning. This is the architecture of every major financial decision you have made or avoided making since you first entered this pressure. Your professional life. Think about the last time you negotiated your salary, or decided not to. The filter was running. Can I afford to be wrong? Can I afford to push back on this offer and risk losing it? Can I afford to be perceived as difficult, or demanding, or replaceable? When margin is thin, the tunnel narrows all of those questions to one answer: take the safe path. Accept what is offered. Do not introduce risk into an already fragile system. Now compare these two versions on the left and right of this split. On the left, the version of you inside the bandwidth tax, entering a salary conversation with an offer on the table, a tight bank account behind you, and the filter running at full force. That version of you is not negotiating from the number this role is worth. That version is negotiating from the number above which the risk of losing the offer becomes terrifying. Every $3,000 you leave on the table in that negotiation is not a negotiation failure. It is the bandwidth tax expressing itself in a professional context. On the right, the version of you with $10,000 behind you, entering the same conversation. You still need the job. But you can afford to wait one more week. You can afford to ask the question once more. The tunnel is open enough that a different question enters the frame first: what is this role actually worth, and what is the cost of waiting for an offer that reflects it? That is a fundamentally different cognitive starting point. And at scale, across a career, the cumulative dollar gap between those two negotiating positions is not measured in thousands. It is measured in decades of compounding difference. Now let's look at the layoff. This is the scene that clarifies the mechanism better than any chart I can show you. Imagine the moment that a manager walks into a meeting with a piece of paper. On the left side of this split, you have 2 months of savings, a car payment, rent in 3 weeks, and a family member who depends on your income. On the right side of this identical split, you have $10,000 in a high-yield savings account, and the same piece of paper in front of you. Follow this divergence carefully, because every variable that comes after this moment changes based on which side you are on. On the left, the piece of paper activates every element of the bandwidth tax simultaneously. The tunnel slams shut. The 247 math starts running at noon. The severance negotiation, which is the most important financial conversation that will happen in the next 3 weeks, takes place inside the tunnel. You cannot afford to push back too hard. You cannot afford to engage an attorney to review the terms. You cannot afford to wait for a better offer. You sign on their timeline because their timeline is the only one available to someone without margin. The severance you receive is likely the first number they offered, because that is the number people without options accept. On the right side of this split, the same piece of paper lands differently in the nervous system. The tunnel does not close. The bandwidth tax activates, but at a lower intensity, because the immediate survival calculation resolves before the full crisis architecture can deploy. You can afford to wait 72 hours before responding. You can afford to consult someone who understands employment law. You can afford to negotiate the terms rather than the amount alone, the non-compete, the reference language, the timing of the payout. And you can afford to walk away from their first offer, which is almost never their best offer. That difference between the severance accepted at the first offer and the severance received after 3 days of negotiation, frequently produces more money than you would earn in the entirety of the following month. And all of it is produced not by financial sophistication, but by the presence or absence of $10,000 removing the bandwidth tax from the most important financial conversation of that chapter of your life. Now let me show you something that removes any remaining possibility of framing what I have described as a cultural or individual phenomenon. Because the most powerful piece of evidence in this entire architecture does not come from a New Jersey shopping mall. It comes from rural India. Track this timeline from beginning to end. Mullainathan and Shafir studied sugarcane farmers in India who receive a single large annual payment at harvest time and then spend it down gradually until the next harvest. What makes this study extraordinary is the control it provides. These are the same people, living the same lives, in the same villages, with the same histories, at two different financial states within the same 12-month period. Before harvest, money is genuinely tight. After harvest, money is more available. Relative to each other, the researchers administered identical cognitive tests to the same farmers at both points in the year. Now follow this trend line as it diverges from the center of the frame in two different directions. The same individuals performed measurably better on cognitive tests after harvest than before. Same people. Same intelligence. Same life experience. Same cultural context. The only variable was the financial pressure of the pre-harvest period. And that variable produced the same cognitive pattern documented in New Jersey. Look at what this means. The bandwidth tax is not a Western phenomenon. It is not a product of American consumer culture or modern financial complexity. It is not a character trait of any particular demographic. It is a human neurological response to financial scarcity that appears consistently across populations, economic systems, agricultural traditions, and levels of formal education. The cage is universal. And so is the exit is margin, not wealth. Margin. The gap between what you have and what the nearest threatening emergency would cost. And for most American households at current median income levels and current emergency cost structures, car repairs, medical bills, job transitions, $10,000 is the point at which that gap becomes large enough to meaningfully reduce the bandwidth tax. Let me now show you what changes at the level of the nervous system, because this is the piece that most financial content describes in terms of stress relief without explaining why the change is as deep as it is. Zoom into this bounded container. The 2:47 in the morning math does not run because you choose to run it. It runs because the nervous system is doing its job. The function of that calculation is protective. It is checking, in the background of sleep, whether the financial situation is survivable, the same way it would check whether a physical environment is safe. It is not a malfunction. It is the risk monitoring system doing exactly what it is designed to do. The reason it stops after $10,000 is not that the risks disappear. It is that the system has a new data point to work with. There is a buffer. The car repair does not cascade into missed rent. The missed workday does not cascade into a missed bill cycle. The unexpected does not immediately trigger the survival architecture. And when the risk monitoring system has evidence that the gap between the threat and the resource is large enough to be managed, it does not need to run the midnight calculation with the same urgency. The first time you sleep through the night after crossing that threshold, the experience is physical. Not emotional. Physical. The nervous system has enough evidence to stand down. And what returns in the space created by that standing down is something that the bandwidth tax had been quietly consuming for years, the capacity to be fully present in the moments that are not about money. Compare these two dinner tables side by side. On the left, the version of you still inside the bandwidth tax, sitting across from someone you care about, while the background calculation runs. You are physically present. But a portion of the attention that would otherwise belong to the person across the table is occupied by the financial noise running underneath everything. The conversation is real. But the version of you in that conversation is the compressed version, the version operating on whatever bandwidth the tax has left after taking its share. On the right, the version of you after the threshold is crossed. The background calculation has quieted enough that the dinner table belongs to the dinner table. The conversation gets the full version. Not a perfect version. Not a version without problems or worries. But a version with access to its full capacity for presence, for listening, for patience, for the kind of attention that relationships require to remain healthy over long periods of time. The research on financial stress and relationship quality documents this consistently. The correlation between financial pressure and relationship deterioration is not primarily about disagreements over money, though those matter too. It is about the cognitive availability tax that financial pressure places on every interpersonal interaction. You cannot give what the tunnel has redirected toward survival. $10,000 begins to give it back. Now let's look at what happens to time once the filter lifts. Because this is the section of the analysis where the mathematics becomes as compelling as the psychology. Place these two timelines side by side, because the contrast is stark and the numbers are real. On the left, the relationship with time inside the bandwidth tax. Each month arrives and the balance resets near where it started. The year passes and the trajectory is flat. Looked at across a decade of earning a decent income, the net accumulation is startlingly low, not because the income was insufficient to build on, but because the bandwidth tax was redirecting every decision toward the immediate and away from the long horizon. The tunnel blocks the horizon. And when you cannot see 20 years from now, you cannot make decisions for 20 years from now. On the right, the relationship with time after the bandwidth tax lifts. Time becomes the most powerful asset in your financial architecture. Not because your income changed, but because the cognitive capacity to think across a longer timeline is now available, and decisions made with that capacity compound in ways that decisions made inside the tunnel cannot. Here is the specific arithmetic. A high-yield savings account at current rates, the best available accounts are currently paying in the range of 4% annually, turns $10,000 into approximately $14,800 over 10 years without a single additional deposit. That is not life-changing on its own. But look at this curve as it tracks the behavior change that accompanies the saved money. Phase 1 begins at the moment of deposit. Follow this progress bar as it moves from left to right. The $10,000 sitting in a high-yield account at 4% generates interest on the balance while preserving complete liquidity. In month 1, the account earns approximately $33 in interest. Notice this trend line as it begins to rise. Not dramatically, but consistently upward. For a nervous system that has watched money flow only in one direction for years, outward, the first statement showing earned interest, interest you did not work for, interest that arrived because the money was present in the right account, lands as evidence of a different relationship with time. Time is no longer the thing that drains the account before the next deposit. Time is now, for the first time, building something. Move to the second layer. The behavioral shift that accompanies the first 10,000 produces a documented pattern that researchers in savings behavior track consistently. Once a household crosses its first significant savings milestone, the probability of the next deposit increases. Not because the income changed. Because the evidence changed. The nervous system has proof that accumulation is possible, and proof, in the absence of the bandwidth tax, is the most powerful motivator in the system. Now follow this trend line from year 1 through year 5. A household that saves $1,000 per month, starting at $10,000, and earns 4% in a high-yield account, ends year 5 with approximately $73,000. The compound growth curve begins to steepen in years 3 and 4 as the interest earned on the growing balance contributes meaningfully to the total. By year 10, the same discipline, $1,000 per month at 4%, produces over $146,000. Compare the left side of this split to the right side. On the left, the decade-long trajectory of someone inside the bandwidth tax whose savings rate is effectively zero because every dollar of margin gets consumed by the same monthly pressures. On the right, the decade-long trajectory of someone who crossed the $10,000 threshold, broke the consumption cycle, and reinvested the bandwidth dividend into consistent, compounding deposits. The gap between those two curves, tracked from the bottom of the chart at year 0 to the top at year 10, is not a gap in income. It is a gap in the cognitive architecture that financial pressure either allows or denies. The numbers are real. The mechanism is documented. And the gap is available to close. Now let me address the objection that is already forming, because I have thought about this carefully enough to know what it is. The objection goes like this: $10,000 is not realistic for most people at most income levels. Framing it as a threshold, as a milestone, as the number that changes things, treats it like a finish line that many people cannot even see the starting line of. And suggesting that the difficulty of getting there is a product of a cognitive tax rather than structural economic conditions, wages, housing costs, healthcare, the actual cost of being poor, papers over the real barriers with a psychological explanation that lets systems off the hook, that is a legitimate and intelligent objection. Here is my honest answer to it: Mullainathan and Shafir were not naive about the structural dimension. Their research does not argue that financial scarcity is merely a mindset problem. It argues that scarcity produces a measurable cognitive effect, and that cognitive effect compounds the structural difficulty. The bandwidth tax does not replace the structural barriers. It runs on top of them, making the existing difficulty harder to navigate than it would otherwise be, and the research does not set $10,000 as the clinical threshold. The Indian sugar cane farmers who showed cognitive improvement after harvest did not reach $10,000. The New Jersey participants whose performance was impaired by a $1,200 car repair scenario were not dealing with $10,000 emergencies. What the research identifies is the margin, the gap between what you have and what the nearest threatening emergency costs. The $10,000 figure is illustrative for the American context, where the most common household emergencies, car repairs averaging $800 to $1,000, emergency room visits, a month of lost income during job transition, cluster in a range that $10,000 comfortably covers, but the principle holds at smaller amounts. Read this carefully. The first $100 of genuine savings changes something at the level of the nervous system. The first $500 changes more. The direction of the effect is consistent even when the magnitude varies. Every dollar of margin you build removes a measurable portion of the cognitive tax. The instruction is not to wait until you have $10,000 to experience the effect. The instruction is to understand the mechanism, so that every dollar moving in the right direction is understood for what it actually is, not just money in an account, but a reduction in the tax on your own cognitive capacity. The path from the 247 math to the 715 morning is not built in a single deposit. It is built in a direction. And the direction begins with the clearest possible understanding of what the deposit is actually buying. Inside this final container, here is what it is buying. Not primarily the emergency protection, though that matters. Not primarily the interest, though that compounds. The primary purchase of the first $10,000 is the return of the bandwidth tax has been consuming. It is the cognitive capacity to see more than one option before committing. To negotiate from a position of choice rather than survival. To make professional decisions on a longer timeline than this week's rent. To be fully present at the dinner table. To sleep through the night. It is the difference between making every decision with the compressed version of yourself, and making decisions with the full version of yourself that financial pressure has been quietly borrowing from. That full version of you was always there. The bandwidth tax was simply running a program in the background that kept you from having complete access to it. Now I want you to sit with one specific question after this. Not how do I get to $10,000. Not where do I cut the budget. Not which account do I open first. Those are execution questions, and they matter, but they come second. The first question is this. Which single automatic behavior, if you started it today and maintained it for the next 12 months, would produce the most consistent movement in the direction of that threshold, inside the actual structure of your income and expenses as they exist right now, not as you wish they were? Not the most dramatic behavior. Not the behavior that gets you there fastest on paper. The most sustainable one. The one that runs with the least friction. The one that happens whether or not you remember to make it happen, because the most important variable in this system is not the size of the deposit. The most important variable is the continuity of the direction. Because the bandwidth tax does not lift all at once. It lifts gradually, incrementally, as evidence accumulates that the cycle is breaking. Each month the balance grows is another data point for the nervous system that the pattern has changed. Each month a small automatic transfer moves before you can spend it is another repetition of the new behavior replacing the old one. The compounding effect of the savings is real and documented. But the compounding effect of the evidence, the consistent, visible, accumulating proof that you are building something, is the engine underneath the mathematics. The 7:15 morning is not a fantasy. It is a neurological state produced by a specific set of conditions, documented by researchers at two of the world's most rigorous academic institutions, replicated across continents, and reproducible in your own life by the accumulation of a specific kind of evidence in a specific kind of account. It is 7:15. The alarm goes off. And for a few seconds before the day starts, the nervous system does not immediately reach for the calculator. The rent is covered. The account exists. The car noise from last Wednesday turned out to be brake pads, $412, handled, resolved, complete, without a single secondary crisis. The morning is just a morning, not a morning without challenges. Not a morning in which everything is solved. A morning in which your full cognitive capacity is available for what the day actually holds, instead of what the 247 math was burning through the night. That is the return on the first $10,000. Not the interest. The architecture of the mind you get to bring to everything else. And the next structural trap, the one that sits between that first threshold and the next level of financial autonomy, I have mapped it here. Click through, and let's look at what is waiting on the other side of the first $10,000. Because crossing the threshold is not the end of the architecture. It is the beginning of a much more interesting set of problems. And you will want to know what they look like before you arrive. The question of what comes next is not abstract. It is already present in the decision you are making right now about whether to keep building from this moment or to return to the pattern that brought you to 2:47 in the morning in the first place. And I want to be direct with you about something before we close, because this is the piece of financial content that most channels will not say explicitly. The reason you are not further along is not that you failed to try hard enough. The research we have covered today documents that explicitly. The reason you are not further along is that you have been attempting to use the cognitive capacity that the bandwidth tax was consuming, to solve the problem that the bandwidth tax was creating. You were trying to plan your way out of the tunnel using the exact thinking capacity that the tunnel was suppressing. That is not a character failure. That is a documented, peer-reviewed feedback loop. And the exit from that loop does not require a raise, a windfall, a promotion, or a different set of circumstances than the ones you currently occupy. It requires a direction. One consistent, automatic, sustainable behavior that moves $1 at a time in the right direction, beginning today, regardless of the amount, because the amount determines the mathematics but the direction determines the nervous system's evidence base, and it is the evidence base that changes the morning. Look at this final split screen one more time. On the left, the version of the morning that belongs to someone still inside the bandwidth tax, beginning the day the same way the day before it ended, with the calculation already running. On the right, the version of the morning that belongs to someone who built the margin, broke the cycle, and installed new evidence in the nervous system over the course of months and years of consistent, boring, automatic deposits. Both of those people are you. The version on the right is not a different person. It is the same person, with access to the full bandwidth that the tax on the left was consuming. That access is what $10,000 buys.